I selected the rainforest picture so that it would be in contrast to the ugly chapters. These are pretty ugly, these chapters. The first two, chapter 17 and 18, you just wonder why they're there, that's all. It's just a peculiar story. But then we move on to that pretty awful story of the Levite that divides his concubine up into 12 pieces and posts her throughout Israel. And you sort of say to yourself, why is it there? And what do we get out of it? First thing I wanted to say is a little bit of defense of the Bible. The fact is, everything God has given us is worth reading and studying. Surely there is nothing in the Bible that is contained between the front and the back that we ought to leave out. Sometimes we may not want to read them in mixed company, etc. I just Google imaged ugly, and that's what came up. So I think that's a fish. But anyway, I've got that to represent the ugly chapters. So why are these chapters there? They've obviously got a message for us. Most of you will probably remember Ezekiel 23, the story of Aholah and Aholibah. The most sexually explicit chapter for sure in the whole of the Bible. Not the sort of thing you want to read in mixed company. Not the sort of thing you would want to probably read with your children at the table after dinner. But it's something that we all ought to read. It is there. It's a gift of God. And we all ought to read it at some time ourselves and try to make some sense of why has God given us this. Genesis 19, the story of Lot's girls. Because we know that was a story of incest. I have a personal opinion that that was blessed because the progeny from those two girls went on to lead to Jesus Christ, and if it wasn't for those two girls, we wouldn't have Jesus. But at the same time, again, not the sort of thing you probably want to read with your kids because it is about incest. Judges 19 is the next one. Good old Judges 19, where this poor woman is sexually assaulted to the point of death. And then she's divided up into 12 pieces and sent throughout the land of Israel. And you wonder what was the point of the story. But I'm going to suggest to you tonight that there is something beautiful comes out of that story. And I think that we do ourselves a great disservice if we don't study it. Because I think you'll see the greatest story of forgiveness and grace that you'll find anywhere in the Old Testament, until we reach Jesus Christ. Okay, so God speaks to us through the Bible. He also speaks to us through prayer. We know that whenever we pray to God, we are heard, but it isn't a two-way conversation. I think all of us recognise that when we pray, we don't get immediate answers. Sometimes we don't get answers at all, or sometimes we can't interpret the answer. But often it can be years later when you look back in your life and see how God was working in it. But at the same time, we continue to pray, and it is a two-way process, but not immediate. Whereas the Bible is our only access to God's thoughts, God's commands, God's love, His grace. The only access we have to the understanding of that is in fact via the Bible. And I think it's really important that we therefore take on every chapter, even if it does appear to be ugly. Talking about prayer for a minute, I might have said this before sometime, but there's a story that a reporter was talking to Mother Teresa and was going to ask her some questions. This might be an urban myth, I don't know, but perhaps it's true. And he said to her, when you're not caring for the poor, what are you doing? And she said, I'm praying. And he said, and what does God say to you? Or what do you say to God? And she says, I don't say anything. I just listen. And the reporter said, well, what does God say to you? And she said, He doesn't say anything. He just listens. And that's a nice description in many ways of our relationship in prayer. It isn't immediate. But on the other hand, let me say that the Bible is immediate. And I'll give you a small story about Ted Spomberg. When I was first a single parent, and it was back in the days when divorce and remarriage was frowned upon in Christian circles, And I went to see Ted and I spoke to him, and every question I asked him, he took me to a verse of the Bible and he showed me that the answer was there in the Bible. And I have never forgotten that, and I found that to be extremely valuable. There is nothing in the Bible that does not deserve to be looked at and studied. And so, off we go. I had a Sunday school class about 7 or 8 years ago. It was a senior Sunday school class. And it was a time when the movie Noah came out. Anybody remember that? The movie Noah, Russell Crowe played Noah. You don't have to unmute, don't worry. So I guess some of you saw it. I said to my Sunday school class, it wasn't very accurate to the Bible. It was interesting, but there was a lot of it that was added on, made up, and not in the Bible, but at the same time it was interesting. And I said it did give a bit of an insight into some of the things we don't understand about Noah. For instance, why did Noah get drunk and roll around the ground naked? And my whole class said, what? I said, Noah got drunk and rolled around the ground naked. And they said, where did you get that from? And I said, the Bible. None of them had ever come across that story. They'd been through all their Sunday school experience, and I can understand that. It's not the sort of bit you'd want to read for a Sunday school class. And I can understand parents when they do the readings thinking, we might leave that chapter and we'll move on. But eventually nobody told them about it. And yet there's a point to it. And so on we go to the book of Judges. First of all, I'm going to move my little tiles. They're covering up a part of this at the moment. I got this off the web, and I'm not going to suggest that it's provably accurate. I can't be bothered going through and trying to figure out the timeline of the book of Judges. The first thing that we did look at when we did Judges a while ago was that it's not in time sequence, it's not chronological, and the judges do not come one after the other. Often some of the judges are happening at the same time. You can see on this diagram there that you can see that Shamgar and Deborah seem to be about the same time as Gideon, etc. I might, if I can, get my little laser pointer. Oh, look at that. How cool. Okay. You can see that down this column here, a lot of them were operating at the same time. They're operating in different parts of the nation. But the thing for tonight that I want to look at, which is actually provable, this chart that I've got here, I don't know whether it's accurate or not, but this bit I do know. This is the line that matters to us tonight. This is the time which, according to this chart, was the time of Ruth and Naomi, but it was also the time of chapter 19 of Judges that we're looking at tonight, and that they've called it the sodomy of Benjamin. In this time, you can actually prove when this timeline occurred because of the statement that Phinehas, Aaron's grandson, was in this story, and we can show that he was there in the first generation in the land after Joshua dies. So there's the line telling us that that's where it happened. That's going to be important. That is critical in what I want to talk about tonight. Okay, so we move on. Having a quick overall look at what these chapters are about. Chapters 17 and 18, we're going to go through them in a bit more detail. I won't read them because there's 5 chapters and it would just take too long to read them all. But I'll give you a brief overview in a moment. But first of all, the first 2 chapters we'll look at are when the people of Dan couldn't take the allotment given to them. They were given the land by Joshua, but they couldn't take it because it was right up against the land of the Philistines that was mountainous, and basically through lack of faith, they were not able to overcome the people of the land, so they decided to move on and find themselves an easier target. So that's what those 2 chapters are about. Then chapter 19 to 21 is the story of the Levite's concubine. which I might say contains every sin imaginable. If you could think of every sin you can think of, they're contained in these chapters, and that's why I call them the ugly chapters. It contains homosexuality, rape, murder. It contains civil war. It contains just about everything. Oh, it also contains abduction, kidnapping, everything you can imagine. And often I can remember the days when I looked at it, and because it was at the end of the book of Judges, I thought that's how the people had degenerated over the 300 or 400 years in which they were without a king or without a leader. That's not true. This was happening in the first generation. As soon as Joshua died, this is what some of the people were up to every sin that you could pick just about and tick off. However, there were good people. This was the same time as Ruth and Naomi. And when we read the story today, we'll see that the men of Israel actually acted really quite well. They did the right thing in going before the Lord and asking for his advice on what they should do. Okay, they're basically the stories. How do we make sure we got the timeline right? From Joshua 24, we read that Eleazar the son of Aaron died, and they buried him in the hill that pertained to Phinehas his son, who was given to him in Mount Ephraim. So, in the book of Joshua, we have the death of Aaron's son. So Aaron's son dies before the book of Judges started. So the book of Judges starts with Phinehas, the grandson, being in the role of high priest. So that's the first generation. And then you go to Judges 20, that's one of the chapters we're looking at tonight. Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, stood by it before in those days. So that tells you that was the first generation. Judges 18, the Danites worshipped the carved image, and Jonathan, descendant of Gershon, son of Moses, and his descendants. So there you've got the same thing, the grandson of Moses. Remember, Moses died, Moses' son had died. First generation in the land. So everything you see happening in these chapters is not happening at the end, but it's happening at the start of the time of the judges. And here's another phrase, which I can remember, and years ago I used to think, well, that just shows you how bad the people degenerated to. Well, we now know they did not degenerate to this. This is the way they started. And you'll find I've just got two phrases out of each of the groups of chapters we're going to look at tonight, but basically repeated over and over and over. In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. That pattern is continually repeated, and you think to yourself, why was it important that the king was there? Why was it that it says there was no king? And that should have been the cohesive thing that held them together. I would have thought the priesthood should have held them together so they didn't do what was right in their own eyes. Perhaps the high priest, perhaps the worship at Shiloh would have been what bound them together. But it evidently didn't. It was in fact the kingship which united the people. In fact, during the time of the judges, the people were fracturing. The tribes of Israel were basically looking after their own selves, and it was almost as if we had 12 little mini nations. It even got so bad at one point that they began to develop separate languages. You might remember that when the Ephraimites came over to fight against Jephthah, when they were defeated, they tried to get back over the Jordan, and the men of Jephthah would say to them, pronounce the word Shibboleth. I don't know, I probably got it wrong. I'll probably lose my head. But if you said Shibboleth the way the people on the eastern side of the Jordan said it, the men of Gilead, you were okay. But if you pronounce it the way the westerners on the western side of Jordan, you'd get your throat cut. So this is the development of different language. The people on the east were mixing with the people around, and they were developing different language. And it was clearly God's design to unify the people, and that's when he brought Samuel in. And Samuel became the unifying force that held all the people together. Okay, now I want to talk about some of the things that tonight we're going to find in these odd chapters that solve some of the problems that we've got in the Bible. Very minimal problems that barely would you even notice out of interest. But oddly enough, these chapters we're looking at tonight give a solution to these problems. Deuteronomy 3. So we took the land at that time out of the hand of the 2 kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan, from the valley of the Arnon to Mount Hermon. The Sidonians call Hermon Sirion, while the Amorites call it Senir. Why is that problematic? Why is it of interest at all? Well, the first thing is you'll notice on our map, that's where Mount Hermon is, that red dot there. And you'll see that that's in the territory of the Amorites. So it's perfectly reasonable that there was an Amorite name. But if it had another name, I would have guessed it would have been the Hivites. The Hivites also bordered on Mount Hermon. But it's not a Hivite name it gets a Sidonian name. And Sidon is way up there. It's even off my map. I can't put it there. Sidon is nowhere near Mount Hermon. So why on earth does it get a Sidonian name quoted for it? If you want to put it into a modern context, it's like saying Ayers Rock is called Uluru by the Aboriginals in Central Australia, but it's called another name by the Aboriginals at Port Macquarie. And you think, why would the Aboriginals at Port Macquarie have a name for Ayers Rock? And that's what this is like. It's not quite that distance, but it's a long way away on the other side of the Hivites. Why quote that? There's an answer, and it comes out of Judges 17 and 18. And here's another one. This looks trivial, but believe me, there are people who make a big deal out of this. Out of 1 Kings and out of 2 Chronicles, we're talking about the same person. He is an artist who comes from the people of Tyre and Sidon. And King Solomon sent and brought Hiram from Tyre. He was the son of a widow of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in bronze. 2 Chronicles says, Now I have sent a skilled man endued with understanding. That Huram is the same as Hiram. Hiram Abi, the son of a woman of the daughters of Dan, and his father's a man of Tyre. It's the same person. When you read the two accounts, it's exactly the same person. But why is the woman called of the tribe of Naphtali in one reference, and in the other one, she is a woman of the daughters of Dan? Now, there's a lot of people who made a big deal out of that, about it being an inconsistency, that these stories are simply made up. And I always get a nice warm feeling when I find that that isn't true. It not only proves an inconsistency, it proves a dramatic consistency. They were both talking about the same thing, which we will see. Okay, here we go. We're going to move on to Judges 17. I'll go through it fairly quickly. Micah, a man of Ephraim, stole 11,000 pieces of silver from his mother. He confessed to it, and she blessed him and said, Oh, you're a wonderful son. Blessed you'll be of the Lord for owning up to this. Let's use a bit of the silver to make a graven and a molten image. She's a pretty understanding mum. That's all I can say. The kid stole the money. 11,000 pieces of silver is an enormous amount of money. Millions and millions of dollars in our money now, because later on in this chapter, you'll see that they try to hire a young Levite to be their priest, and they bribe him and offer him his keep by paying him 10 pieces of silver a year. 10 pieces of silver was a man's wage, yearly wage. And this person stole 11,000 pieces of silver. That's like millions of dollars. Anyway, then we have verse 6. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that was right in his own eyes. This keeps coming up over and over. A young Levite from Bethlehem in Judah travelled north. He came to Micah's place and Micah offered him a house there. Micah asked him to stay and be his priest, give him 10 pieces of silver per annum plus his living. The Levite accepted, so the young man becomes a priest in the house of Micah. Micah also has a shrine, an ephod and a teraphim, as well now as the graven and the molten image, which is made out of the silver. He is obviously worshipping in a way which is not prescribed. A shrine means, I guess, some sort of an altar. An ephod was just a priestly garment, and I presume that made that up himself. It would seem to me that in those days they thought the ephod had some magical powers. Whenever David would inquire of the Lord, he would ask Abiathar to bring the ephod, and Abiathar would hold the ephod in his hand while he sought the counsel of the Lord. So they saw something in the ephod which I don't fully understand. Maybe someone can help. A teraphim's an idol. So this man was an idol worshipper, obviously made one of his sons priests. He was not a Levite, but now he's got a Levite. And look what he says in the last line. Then Micah says, "Now I know the Lord will prosper me because I've got a Levite for a priest." That shows you the level of understanding that these people had. His house is full of idols. His house is full of everything which was prohibited by the worship at Shiloh. But he reckons now he's got a Levite, he's set. In those days, again, there was no king in Israel. The Danites were seeking inheritance to live in because so far they hadn't got one. Well, they had. They'd been given one. They just couldn't take it. They just couldn't defeat the people because they didn't put their trust in God. So the Danites sent 5 men to look for land. They went east over to Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. They recognised the Levite. They said, "Why are you here?" And he said, "Well, Micah's hired me to be his priest." The 5 men left and went right up the Jordan Valley, right up to Laish, which is at the base of Mount Hermon, and they saw the people dwelt there securely like the Sidonians and had no dealings with anyone. They came back to Dan and said, "Let's attack them. We've seen the fertile land and we can overcome them." So 600 armed men of Dan came to Ephraim to the house of Micah. Then the 5 men who'd previously been there said, "Do you know that in this house there's an ephod, a teraphim, a graven image, and a molten image?" And they entered Micah's house and asked for the Levite. 600 Danite soldiers stood at the gate, and the 5 men went and took out the graven image and the ephod, the teraphim, and the molten image. So they stole them all. So here's the second time the silver's going to get stolen. So it's stolen this time by the Danites. When the priest objected, they said, "Keep quiet and come with us. Be a priest for us. What's best? Priest to the house of one man, or to be a priest to a tribe in Israel?" And the priest was pretty happy. He took the ephod, the teraphim, the graven image, and he went with the Danites. Why not? I'm sure he's going to get more than 10 pieces of silver per year. So they left. Micah overtook the Danites, and Micah shouted to them, "You have taken my gods and my priest." The Danites said to him, "Shut up or we'll kill you and your household." Then Micah saw that they were too strong for him, so he went back home. The Danites went to Laish, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, and killed them all, burned the city. No one helped them because it was far away from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone. They were a colony of Sidonians at the base of Mount Hermon. And they rebuilt the city and named it Dan. The Danites set up the graven images for themselves, and Jonathan, the son of Gershon, son of Moses, and his sons were priests. And that tells you the timeline. This tells you it was the first generation, because that when Moses' grandson was there, and it was there all the days of Shiloh. Now, you can sort of see why it's obvious how Deuteronomy was referring to something which was real. It was a real fact. Over here, this is where the people of Dan went to. They came from Dan here. This was the land allotted to them, but they couldn't beat the Philistines here. So they moved across through Ephraim, up the Jordan Valley, killed everybody in the town of Laish, and they were all Sidonians. it repeatedly says that they were far away from anyone, lived after the style of the Sidonians, they were peaceful people, had no dealings with anyone, and they were a long way from Sidon. That's why Mount Hermon gets a Sidonian name. That's why, unconnected, in Deuteronomy 3, you find that there's just this thread that connects you to the truth of all the stories that are written. I don't reckon you could have planned that. I don't reckon if you were making these stories up, you couldn't have planned it. And so that gives that explanation. And now you come to this one. Why was the woman that had this child called a widow of the tribe of Naphtali and also a widow of the daughters of Dan? Well, again, if you look here at this picture, you'll see that Dan is inside the territory of Naphtali. The city of Dan that the Danites took from the people of Laish, from the Sidonians, was inside the territory of Naphtali. So it was perfectly true to say that this woman was a widow of the tribal area of Naphtali. But she was obviously from the people of Dan, and so she was of the daughters of Dan. You'll notice there's a subtle difference. One says of the tribe of Naphtali, meaning the tribal land. The other one says of the daughters of Dan, meaning her lineage. And that's exactly what you would have if you lived here. And there's one more thing. Who did she marry? She married a man of Tyre. How would a woman of Israel find a man of Tyre to marry? Because this was occupied Sidonians, and Sidonians and the Tyre people are the same. Tyre and Sidon are just twin cities of the same people. So in this city, not only could she be a widow of the tribe of Naphtali, not only could she be a widow of the lineage of Dan, but she could have found a man of Tyre and Sidon to marry, because that's the people that was living there. Doesn't mean much, but I sort of like all that stuff because it sort of says to you that the Bible is true. I know we all believe it's true, but it's nice every now and again to have a reason to say that's the truth of it. Okay, this is sort of the nasty bit, but there's a reason for this too. In those days there was no king in Israel. It seems that phrase gets repeated over and over and over. And a Levite from Ephraim had a concubine from Bethlehem. His concubine left him and went to her father's house. Her husband went after her to bring her back. He remained with the father 4 days, and then they left in the afternoon. And late that afternoon the servant said, "Let's stay in Jebus." That's the old name for Jerusalem. You remember Jerusalem was still in the hands of the Jebusites until David, well, literally Joab took it for David. So it was a Gentile city run by the Jebusites. But the Levite would not stay with foreigners and said to his servants, "Spend the night at Gibeah in Benjamin." So they got to Gibeah and they sat down in the city square. So there they are, waiting for some kind soul to come along and help them. But I just want to make one small note which might be of interest later. The Levite would not stay in a city of Gentiles. And I think this is a little bit of a hint that we've got this legalistic attitude of the Levites. The Levites, by the time we get to Jesus' day, we know what the Levites are like. They are rigid legalists. They haven't got an ounce of love or grace within them. And I can see this is probably starting here. They were certainly like it 500 years BC, 500 years before Jesus. They were also legalists back then. And I suspect that this is much the same, where he says, "I won't soil myself by staying with foreigners. I'll stay only in the town of Israel." So an old man of Ephraim was staying in Gibeah, and he said, "From where do you come?" And he said to him, "We're going from Bethlehem to Ephraim. We just need to stay somewhere overnight." The old man brought him into his house. They were drinking, and some of the city base fellows surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said, "Bring out the men that came into your house, that we may know them." The old man said, "No, do not act so wickedly. Do not do this vile thing. Behold, here's my virgin daughter and his concubine, have them. Don't do such a vile thing to this man. But the men would not listen. So the Levite put his concubine out to them, and they abused her all night until the morning. And daybreak they let her go. And in the morning the woman fell down at the door of the man's house. Horrible story, but there's some meaning to it. Her master rose in the morning, and when he opened the doors of the house, there was his concubine lying on the door with her hands on the threshold. If that's not one of the most heart-rending sentences in the Bible, I don't know what is. That poor woman was sexually abused all night, and her hands were clinging to the door to try to get into the safety of that house. And the men inside were drinking. I don't know how you can explain that. And then the Levite says, this is giving us a feeling for the Levite. This is giving us a feeling for what he's like. He's prepared to see his concubine raped to death. Then he comes out and he says, get up, let's get going. But there was no answer. Then he put her upon the ass, and the man went away to his home. When he entered his house, he took a knife, divided her limb by limb, sent the 12 pieces throughout the territories of Israel. Now, it may not be quite as it's written here. It may not be that he walked out and said, okay, let's get up, let's get going. That might be a bit too severe. But he obviously showed no care or consideration. This is going to be important to a part of the story. Then all the people of Israel came and assembled before the Lord. And the Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered, recounted his story and said, behold, you people of Israel, what should be done? So all the men of Israel decided to send a delegation to the city of Gibeah. The men of Israel demanded the men of Benjamin give up the men of Gibeah who had done this evil, that they may put them to death. But the Benjamites would not listen, but came to battle against the people of Israel. The first thing you'll notice is that the people of Israel assembled themselves before the Lord. And I think that's a pretty good sign, that not all of them were that bad. I think the men of Gibeah were maybe the odd ones out, that the people of Israel were probably not too bad at this stage. The Benjamites mustered 26,700 swordsmen. Among all of these were 700 picked men who were left-handed. Everyone could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. And the men of Israel, apart from Benjamin, mustered 400,000 men. So there's the battle joined, 26,500 against 400,000. But there are 700 picked best fighter men of Benjamin, and they actually came from Gibeah, and they were all left-handed men. That's important. The men of Israel were defeated twice by the men of Benjamin. And they came and besought the Lord. They said to God, should we go up to fight? And God said, yes, go up and fight. They went up and they fought and they lost. Then the second time they came before the Lord and inquired of the Lord via the priest. And they said, tell us, should we go and fight against Benjamin? God said, go up. They went up and fought and lost again. Then the people inquired of the Lord again. And again, this is where it says the ark of the covenant of God was there in those days, and Phinehas the son of Eleazar the son of Aaron was ministering in those days. And they said, shall we yet go up again to battle? The Lord said, yes, tomorrow I will give them into your hand. But it seemed to me they were sort of doing the right thing. They were bringing their problem to the Lord. They were asking his advice. The Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and the men of Israel destroyed 25,100 men of Benjamin. And if you figure out how many soldiers Benjamin had, 25,700 to start with, that leaves only 600 men. And I wonder who the 600 men were. Well, I can't guarantee all of them, but I bet they were their best soldiers who could sling a stone at the breadth of a hair. 18,000 men of Benjamin fell due to an ambush, and the remainder turned and fled to the rock of Rimmon. So all who fell that day of Benjamin were 25,000 men that drew the sword. But 600 men turned and fled to the rock of Rimmon. They abode there at the rock of Rimmon for 4 months. So we've got 600 men, a lot of which were left-handed men. And they were the only survivors from the whole tribe of Benjamin. The men of Israel had taken an oath. Not one of us will give his daughter in marriage to a Benjaminite. The people prayed to God and asked advice to save the tribe of Benjamin from extinction. The men of Israel had vowed to destroy any who had not joined the fight. They discovered that no one from Jabesh and Gilead had come to fight. They sent soldiers to Jabesh Gilead and slaughtered everyone except 400 virgins. So they got 400 young women who had never had sex with men, and these 400 young women they took to give to the Benjaminites, but there was still not enough. 200 of the poor old Benjaminites were left without a girl. So they instructed the men of Benjamin to come to Shiloh and to hide, and when the women came out to dance, the young women, they would race out and grab one. And imagine them all rushing for the pretty ones. Anyway, whatever happened, that's the story. And you might say, well, what do we get from that? I'm going to talk about one thing first, which is not particularly beautiful, but the next one I find, as I said, is the most beautiful story of grace that you'll find in the Old Testament. I'm going to read the first couple of verses of chapter 9 again out of the King James Version. This is Judges 19. And it came to pass in those days, when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite sojourning on the side of Mount Ephraim, who took to him a concubine out of Bethlehem in Judah. And his concubine played the whore against him, and went away from him unto her father's house, and was there 4 months. And her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly unto her, and to bring her again. And she brought him into her father's house, and when the father of the damsel saw him, he rejoiced to meet him, and his father-in-law, the damsel's father, retained him, and he abode there 3 days, so that he'd eat and drink and were happy. What's wrong with that story? As soon as you read it, there's something that just says to you, that's wrong. Something in it doesn't ring true. See that word there? That doesn't mean that she was unfaithful, that is, that she might have had an affair with another man. That literally means to become a prostitute. His concubine became a prostitute against him. If that's true, the rest of the story doesn't make sense. She decides to be a prostitute, so she leaves her husband. Where does she go? To her dad's house. Can you imagine a daughter who left her husband to become a prostitute, going to dad's house and saying, Dad, can I move in with you? Can I have a room so I can work out of that? No father in Israel would take a daughter back whose aim is to be a prostitute when she's left her husband. And what did the husband do? He arose and went after her to speak kindly unto her, to woo her back. That's what he went to do. Now I would bet my boots that no Levite is ever going to try to woo his wife back if she's decided to be a prostitute. I mean, she should have been stoned to death. That's what should have happened. She was his wife. And the only reason I'm emphasising this is to say that when we read the Bible, we need to read it carefully enough to see and to pick out when something's going wrong. Detect when there's something that isn't kosher in the whole thing. And this is easily solved, this one. But we could just read over it. And I think it's really sad if we do. Here I'm going to remove my little tiles again because they're always over what I want to read. This is Judges 19 out of the Septuagint. And his concubine departed from him and went away. No mention of being a prostitute. Here's the NET Bible, and I might suggest to you that the NET is the best translation we have. I think it stands for the New English Translation. It's an extremely erudite translation, and it in fact goes right back to source materials. It takes nothing from any other translations, and it goes right back to the little fragments of bits and pieces that have got little bits of the Gospels on them and all that sort of stuff, and probably the most accurate translation. It says, however, she got angry with him. Doesn't that make sense? She got angry. Where would a girl go if she gets angry with her husband? Back to dad. Back to the parents' house. What would the husband do if he still loved her, but she was angry? He would go and try to woo her back. He would go and speak kindly to her. So it all fits. Okay, here's the comment from the NET Bible. Was unfaithful to him is a possibility. Many have understood the Hebrew verb, and I'm not going to try to pronounce that, as being from another root verb to be a prostitute, but it may also be derived from a root meaning to be angry or to hate, as attested to in the Akkadian language. Obviously, Akkadian was still the root of the Hebrew language back in those days. So we have the choice between the two. So which should we decide is right? Look at the story. Which one fits? Would it be that the girl decided to be a prostitute and goes back to work out of her dad's house, and the Levite goes after her to try to woo her back? I think not. I can imagine the Levite stoning her to death. But if she got angry with him over something and went back to her dad's house, I can imagine the Levite chasing her and speaking kindly. And I guess this is just simply saying we should give ourselves time to look carefully at the words we read and to try to make sense out of them. And here we come to our hand-picked left-handed men. And the Benjaminites mustered out of their cities on that day 26,000 men who drew the sword, beside the inhabitants of Gibeah who mustered 700 picked men. Among all of these were 700 picked men were left-handed men. Everyone could sling a stone at a hair. But 600 men finally escaped and went to the rock Rimmon and abode on that rock for 4 months. Most of them would have been probably the left-handed, the best soldiers. Who was the next judge picked for Israel? These men represented absolute evil. These men were actually from Gibeah. They were not even just Benjaminites, they were from the city of iniquity. And these were the men that escaped. These were the ones that became the kind of core for the future Benjamites. Judges 3. But when the people of Israel cried to the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, a Benjaminite, a left-handed man. Now I'm going to bet my boots that Ehud was one of the 600 men who went to the rock of Rimmon. He was one of the 600 left-handed men because it's of the same time frame. It exactly happened before the selection of the second judge, Ehud. And you read into that what I think is one of the most wonderful stories of forgiveness and grace. This man had pitted himself against God at every level you could think of, and God has forgiven him. He obviously in his own heart has realised that they were wrong. I can only imagine that he has subjugated himself to God in repentance, and God says, not only are you forgiven, but I shall make you my representative. And from that dreadful mess comes this beautiful story of grace, that Ehud stands up there and he becomes the left-handed man who saves Israel. And I just think that's beautiful. Of course he was meant to be left-handed. We all know that he had to be left-handed because he had the sword strapped on the wrong side of his body when he went in to stab King Eglon. But the fact is that it follows immediately from that story, and it makes it so important that we get the timeline relatively right. And I think I'm finished. Oh, there's the finish. Grace and forgiveness. You look at an ugly story, and maybe we could look at all the ugly stories. Maybe we could look at the stories in the Bible that sometimes we do shy away from and don't want to read, but they're there for a purpose. They're there to tell us something. And out of all that ugliness can something beautiful can come. and I'm going to stop sharing.